Sequels, the consequented creations designed to appeal towards two main key demographics. First are the eager games playing public who wants to see more of a certain game, and secondly are money-hungry publishers who want to squeeze every last potential pound from a popular IP. Most of the time when a sequel is released, it's the product of a studio extending or refining the work it did in the game before it. But sometimes a studio begins creating a whole new IP, but then right near the end, they suddenly and arbitrarily slap on the name of a previously known game and call the new title a sequel, even though it was never designed or planned to be that way. So this episode, we take a look at these doctored descendants, these adjusted epilogues, and these fiddled follow-ups. As I say... But, hello you, I'm Guru Larry, and I welcome you to Fact Hunt. 5 games that were never meant to be sequels. In the late 1980s, ninjas were at the forefront of popular culture. Shadow Warriors were delighting arcade goers, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles was making parents' wallets cry, and movie reviewers were giving criminally low scores to Big Trouble in Little China. Sega saw this ninja craze and responded by releasing Shinobi into the arcade during 1987. The following year, Sega created a fantastic port of Shinobi for its home console, the Sega Master System. Then in 1989, Sega allowed Tengen to port it to the Nintendo NES. But let's not worry about that for now. This was around the time Konami were creating cute parodies of its own games. Parodius is famously a parody of Gradius, and Kid Dracula is a cute parody of Castlevania. Sega, who were never adverse to borrowing ideas or copyrighted materials, got straight to work on making their own cute parody of Shinobi for the Master System, called Shinobi Kid. Billed as a mix of Shinobi and Alex Kidd, Shinobi Kid was playable to attendees of the January 1990 Consumer Electronics Show and was due out later that year. But later that year, when the game came out, it was no longer Shinobi Kid. It was now Alex Kidd in Shinobi World. Sega changed the main character out in favour of popular mascot Alex Kidd and changed the name to reflect that. But that's not all that was changed. In the final release version, the first boss you go up against while playing as Alex is called Kabuto. But during development as Shinobi Kid, the first boss was called Mario and bore a striking resemblance to a certain Italian plumber. Although, even in the final game, once you hit him with a few shots, he shrinks down to his less powerful state, just like Nintendo's mascot. Sega really did have big dreams for Alex Kidd becoming their company mascot. However, those ideas, along with a popular ninja craze, died out at the end of the 80s, swept away by an era of attitude and blue hedgehogs. On the NES, the Contra games by Konami were some of the more well-known titles in the system's library. In fact, the first game in the series was so synonymous with Nintendo's machine, there were many gamers who didn't even realise that the title was a port of an arcade game. Although, if you lived in Europe, you wouldn't be playing Contra anyway. You'd be playing the localised version of the game, which is called Probotector. But, to be fair, if you lived in Europe, you were probably playing a Sega Master System and not an NES. Konami followed up with a second game called Super Contra for the Japanese Famicom. Then, for reasons that are still not fully understood to this day, Super Contra got renamed to Super C when it was brought to audiences in America. Europe, however, continued the theme of changing everything to robots and received the game as Probotector 2. And before we move on, I'd just like to point out what a bizarre reverse situation it is that the European version of this game is the one that has the mech robots in, and the Japanese version is the one with army guys in it. Anyway, a couple of years later, Konami were developing a new run and gun IP for the Japanese Famicom, called Archound. By the time it was featured in Japanese gaming magazines, the game was all but finished. Promotional artwork was complete, and the screenshots looked polished. But alas, Archound was never released in Japan, and it was never released to the Sega playing public of Europe either. America, however, did see a release of the game, but not before Konami scribbled over the words Archound and decided it should be called Contraforce instead. Normally, getting an exclusive Konami Nintendo game would be something to be happy about, but Contraforce is filled with cheap enemy placement, slightly dodgy controls, and an infuriating bug that causes a screen to not scroll correctly and almost always causes you to run into something that will kill you. So, while Americans at the time thought they were getting a new Contra game, in actual fact they were getting a run and gun title Konami didn't have much faith in releasing anywhere else. In 1993, LucasArts released the fantastic Zombies Ate My Neighbours, or just Zombies if you lived in the United Kingdom. A fun maze-based shooter that had you running around trying to save the humans while blasting at various zombies and monsters. It was an enjoyable game which not only sold well, but also had an impressive game engine pushing the title along. In fact, the Zombies engine was so good, it was also used to power a few other games too, namely Big Sky Trooper, Metal Warriors, and a third game being developed by a small Malaysian studio called Motion Pixel. Thanks to LucasArts, this third game, however, changed direction during development and became Ghoul Patrol, the sequel to Zombies Ate My Neighbours. Designer of the first game, Mike Herbert, reported years later that he saw Ghoul Patrol during its development, and it was originally a brand new IP and had nothing to do with Zombies Ate My Neighbours. Maybe someone at LucasArts didn't think the project would sell too well if the game didn't have the zombies name to draw interest from. But whoever that was, they either ruined a perfectly good original game, or managed to find a way to push interest into a game that would have otherwise sank without a trace. Because what we do know is that Ghoul Patrol is an awful game. Hideous level design, a disastrous soundtrack, and dire character control, which is quite a remarkable feat, as the first game had quick and fluid controls, and Ghoul Patrol literally runs on the same game engine. Ghoul Patrol is worse than the first game in every possible way, and if LucasArts had to slap the Zombies Ate My Neighbours IP on to improve what was being developed, then God only knows what sort of turd would have been released if they didn't. In early 1994, the game's playing public were instructed to grab their nuts by a promotional campaign advertising the game Mr. Nuts, when in actual fact Ocean Software really should have told everyone to hold their noses, as they dropped a stinker. Although I'm just being mean for comic effect here, Mr. Nuts didn't really raise the bar in terms of the platform genre it was competing in. It was decent enough, if a somewhat unremarkable game, released at a time when mascot platformers were all the rage. You control anthropomorphic squirrels through some rather generic levels. I mean, the first stage, which is set in a forest, is called Woody Land of all things. And instead of trying to find the Woody and Nuts joke here, let's move on to what happened in the next game in this series. Only a few months later, a whole new Mr. Nuts game was released for the Amiga, called Mr. Nuts Hopping Mad. It followed the first game's style of platforming, but added an overworld map very much in the style of Super Mario World on the SNES. It did seem a bit odd that in under a year Ocean had brought out a second Mr. Nuts game, and instead of releasing it to console that housed the first title, it had been brought to the Amiga, which was pretty much at the end of its life. What had actually happened is developer Kaiko were initially developing a game called Timmet the Flying Squirrel for the 16-bit Commodore, which had nothing to do with Mr. Nuts. But once Ocean had been granted the publishing rights to Timet, they requested that Kaiko make some changes to the game, and one of those changes was to sprite swap Timet for Ocean's Mr. Nuts IP, probably as a way to get as many sales as they could from the dying home computer. Not too long after the Amiga release, Ocean announced a Mega Drive port, now renamed Mr. Nuts 2. Even though review copies were sent out to magazines, the Mega Drive version was ultimately cancelled just before release, and it wasn't until a leaked copy of the source code found its way onto the internet in 2012 that Sega fans could finally try the title out. In hindsight, cancellation was probably for the best. Ocean releasing the first game and then only months later attempting to sell game as a sequel would have been a silly idea. In fact, you could say it was nuts. I'll get me coat. Everyone and their dog knows the original Quake, the next title from id Software after their runaway success with Doom. But unlike the Imp Annihilator before it, Quake was a true three-dimensional polygonal romp through a series of medieval-themed levels. Well, they were all medieval apart from the first of each episode, which used id-based textures, possibly as a way to gently introduce Doom players into the new game. But outside of that, everything was as medieval as Nintendo's attitude towards fan-made games. However, when Quake 2 hit store shelves, the medieval theme was nowhere to be seen, ditched in favour of a more sci-fi aesthetic, which id Software was free to explore now that John Romero had left the company, preferring to curse the world with the development of Daikatana. But it wasn't just a new theme that id Software was looking at, because during development, Quake 2 wasn't even planned to be the sequel to Quake. Tim Willits, the level designer on Quake 2, told PC Gamer that they wanted to make something different, and adopting the name Quake 2 was mainly a convenience due to no one on the development team being able to agree on a name that they all liked. Names like War, Lock and Load and Strog were all considered by the team, but in the end, thankfully Strog was left on the cutting room floor, Quake 2 prevailed, and everyone was happy. Well, until Romero finally did release Daikatana anyway. Hello you! Thanks ever so much for watching. Be sure to subscribe to be first to see future Fact Hunt episodes. Click on the bell if you already are to make sure you're notified, and be sure to check out my other episodes. And if you want to be super awesome, check out my Patreon. But thanks again for watching, and until next time friends, I'm missing you already.